Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Nice to see everybody on this very chilly morning. I do see a little bit of frost outside my window. So I hope you're inside and warm at the moment. Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. So of course, the excitement this morning is going to be your lab exam today at 9:30, right? That's the challenge before you this morning. And Courtney, I'm sorry to hear about your mom. I hope she's okay. All right. Just to remind everybody, right, we do have our second lab exam of the semester this morning at 9:30. Please log into classmarker.com and take your exam. There are 35 questions on the exam, which means you have 35 minutes to complete it. Okay, so good luck with that. You've been working very hard. I know you have. Okay, so do you have any questions before we begin today? Okay, all right. Folks, we are a little bit behind schedule, believe it or not, so I'm going to pick up the pace just a little bit. My desire is to finish my notes in chapter 9 today and be ready to start chapter 10 next week, okay? So let's continue here. I'm going to bring up our note-taking document. And let me just highlight again that we are starting chapter 9 here, okay? And there are pieces of chapter 9 that you are not responsible for, right? Okay, I mentioned last time that you are not responsible for the joint anatomy itself in this chapter. And what I mean by that is that, if you were to look at some of the pictures later in the chapter, such as figure 911, figure 912, figure 913, figure 914, and 915, those big anatomy hunks of information you are not responsible for. I'm not going to be asking you intimate details about that anatomy. What I am going to be focusing on for chapter 9 is your understanding of the various types of joints that are described by anatomy, and also the various vocabulary terms of motion describing how joints move when muscles contract, okay? So our coverage of chapter 9 will be abbreviated, and I want you to understand what you're responsible for and what you are not responsible for, okay? Do you have any questions? Okay, please ask along the way if anything comes up, all right? So let's start with some basic information. The term joint, okay? The term joint refers to an articulation or an arthrosis. In other words, joint is synonymous with the word articulation, and joint is synonymous. It means the same thing as arthrosis. Okay, so I'm going to try to underline important vocab words for you here in the notes, because these are vocab words that could pop up on your future exam. Okay, so a joint is the same thing as an articulation, which is the same thing as an arthrosis. If we talk about, well, what exactly is a joint? A joint is a point of contact, most normally between two bones, or in some cases between a bone and a piece of cartilage, or there's also some joints where we refer to the contact between bone and your teeth in your jaw as a joint as well, okay? So the term joint refers to a point of contact between two bones, between a bone and a piece of cartilage, or between a bone and your teeth, okay? Most of us normally and appropriately think of joints as interfaces between two bones coming together, but from a formal perspective, it can include a bone and a piece of cartilage, which will highlight, if you remember the pubic symphysis, okay, the pubic symphysis, there's a piece of fibrocartilage between the pubis bones of the pelvic girdle, okay? And of course, you are aware of your teeth. Your teeth fit into the alveolar sockets of the mandible, okay? All right, the term arthrology, okay? Arthrology is the study of joints. And there's this phrase kinesiology, right? We're going to be talking just a little bit about the motion of the joints. So kinesiology is an appropriate term. Kinesiology is the study of motion of the human body. Okay, so this is just some basic starting information to begin to frame our conversation this morning. All right, let's talk about types of joints. Okay, this is, as I said up here, we're going to be talking about the types of joints in chapter 9. This is a major talking piece of what you would be held accountable for on an exam. Okay, so types of joints. When we talk about types of joints, we can basically refer to joints in two different ways of thinking. Two different modes of thinking is used by anatomists to describe joints. We can talk about joints or classify joints from a structural perspective, which is to say what a joint is made of, or we can also talk about joints from a functional perspective in terms of what is the amount of motion that a joint is capable of. Okay, so joints can be classified either structurally, meaning the composition of the joint, or functionally, functionally refers to the amount of motion the joint permits. Okay, so joints can be described structurally or functionally. We're going to give you examples of these classifications. Okay, let's start talking about structural classification first. The structural classification of joints is based on two criteria. Those criteria are the presence or absence of a space in between the articulating bones. That space is known as the synovial cavity. So the first criteria for structural classification is the presence or absence of a synovial cavity. And again, you understand the synovial cavity is referring to space in between the bones that are at the joint. Okay, so the first criteria for structural classification is the presence or absence of a synovial cavity. The second criteria is the type of connective tissue that's found at the joint that's helping bind or connect the bones together. Okay, so let's give you some examples of structural classification joints here. So we're going to talk about the types of structural joints. Okay, your first structural joint, and here I'm going to refer to some imagery in your textbook. If you have your textbook available, that'll make things easier this morning. Okay, so the first category of structural joint would be a fibrous joint. Fibrous joints are shown to you in figure 9.1. Fibrous joints, as you start to look at figure 9.1, we're going to come back to fibrous joints and look at them in a little bit more detail in about 5 minutes or so. But as you look at figure 9.1, fibrous joints have no synovial cavity. There's no space in between the bones. I mean, look at the coronal suture there, which you have some familiarity with from your time in lab. There's no space, right? Those bones are locked together very, very tight. So no synovial cavity, and the bones are held together by dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay, that dense, irregular connective tissue is going to be absolutely loaded up with collagen fibers. Okay, so that's the first type of structural joint, or the fibrous joints. All right, if we turn the page in your textbook, we see figure 9.2. These are the cartilaginous joints. Cartilaginous joints also do not have a synovial cavity. There's no synovial cavity. And with the cartilaginous joint, the bones are actually going to be held together by cartilage, okay? I mean, we've talked at numerous times about pieces of cartilage. You might recall our conversation in chapter 6 when we talked about the anatomy of a typical long bone. We emphasized the epiphyseal growth plate. You see that as the middle image in figure 9.2. Well, the epiphyseal growth plate is primarily made of cartilage, right? So there you have an example of that. So the bones are held together by cartilage. Okay, so you can see from a structural perspective, the fibrous joints and cartilaginous joints are both very similar in the fact that there is no synovial cavity. Where they differ is in the type of tissue that's helping to hold the bones together. All right, the third type of synovial joint, the third type of fibrous joint, sorry folks, going too fast. The third type of structural joint is the synovial joint, okay? And that you're going to see in figure 9.3. If we're being honest here, figure 9.3 is certainly an example of a synovial joint. You also have examples of synovial joints deeper in the chapter. These things you're not really responsible for from an anatomy perspective, but as an example, right? Your shoulder, which allows your arm to rotate in 360 degrees. That is a beautiful example of a synovial joint, okay? So a synovial joint, as you can predict, does have a synovial cavity, and we'll point out what that really means in just a few minutes. Okay, so a synovial cavity is present. Okay, a synovial cavity is present, and the bones are held together by dense, irregular tissue that's part of a larger structure called an articular capsule, okay? So in figure 9.3 there, if you're looking at figure 9.3, look at panel A on the left-hand side, and let me ask you in the chat window, in figure 9.3, part A, what color is the articular cavity? What color is the articular cavity of figure 9.3? Thank you, Shay. Let's wait and just get a couple more folks contributing here. Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. All right, it's yellow. Well, folks, the articular cavity is the same thing as the synovial cavity. The articular cavity is the synovial cavity. Okay. A synovial cavity, also called an articular cavity, is present. Okay. All right. And as we said, the bones are held together by dense irregular tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, which is part of the articular capsule. So, in the same picture, panel A on the right side of the joint, you see the phrase articular capsule. In picture B, so on the left-hand side, you see the phrase articular capsule. So the bones are held together by dense irregular connective tissue that forms an articular capsule. Okay. All right. So again, just underlining a few phrases which might be important to you for examination purposes. Okay, folks, so those are the three types of structural joints that are defined by anatomists. Now let's switch gears for a moment and talk about functional classification, because we can describe the fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial joints an alternative way, which is to say a functional way. And it's really not that bad. Let's take a look at this. All right, letter D, types of functional joints. Okay, so the first descriptive term for a functional joint is a synarthrosis. A synarthrosis, okay. And so let me type that out here. A synarthrosis is a joint which is largely immovable. So a synarthrosis is a joint which the bones really don't move at all. They're locked tightly in place in respect to each other. So this is an immovable joint. Okay. So I'm going to ask you another question in the chat window. Okay, hold on a second. Here we go. Here it comes. What type of structural joint seems comparable, seems similar, seems identical, seems analogous to the synarthrosis? Okay, think about your knowledge of the skeleton that you already know about. Think about the three types of structural joints we just defined for you: fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial. Which of these three seems to be the most immovable? The most immovable. What do you think, folks? Okay, thanks, Noah. Thank you, Raquel. Scarla, let's get one more person contributing. Okay, thanks, Karen. All right, so I would agree with those of you that have gone with the answer of fibrous. Think about the coronal suture you see in figure 9.1 panel A. Think about the sutures you learned about when you were studying the bones of your skull, right? Now we know when an infant is born, those sutures are made of soft tissue and it allows the bones of the skull to flex and move around a little bit. That's important for the birthing process so the child's head can get through the birth canal, right? But as the child grows up and matures, ultimately those soft spots, those fontanelles, will ossify into rigid bone tissue. And at that point, those bones that are on opposite sides of the suture, really, they don't move. They're locked into place, okay? So a synarthrosis is an immovable joint, okay? This is analogous to fibrous joints. This is analogous to fibrous joints from a structural classification perspective, okay? So a synarthrosis is a functional classification word, and the comparable structural term would be fibrous. So synarthrosis and fibrous joints are the same things, classified two alternative ways. Okay. Next, we have amphiarthrosis. And an amphiarthrosis joint is a slightly movable joint. Okay. And just to move things along here, right, a slightly movable joint is going to be analogous to the cartilaginous joint. So when we talk about an amphiarthrosis, you could be looking at the cartilaginous joints of figure 9.2. And finally, we'll take the one that's easiest to match up, because a diarthrosis is a freely movable joint, right? So think about the shoulder, think about rotating your arm around. That clearly moves a lot, right? So a diarthrosis is going to be analogous to a synovial joint. So a diarthrosis is a freely movable joint. This is analogous to a synovial joint, okay? All right, folks, are you okay? Any questions or problems right now? Okay, let's continue. All right, so now that we've defined how we can classify the joints, structural and functional, and we've listed the various types of structural and the various types of functional, now what I'm going to go in is just a little bit more detail about the structural classifications themselves. So I'm going to start with fibrous joints. Okay. So a more detailed look at fibrous joints. Okay, so once again, right, a fibrous joint has no synovial cavity. The articulating bones are held together by dense irregular connective tissue. We've already said that, okay? We've already typed that into your notes. Let's take a little bit longer time to actually look at the various types of fibrous joints. And again, we're looking at figure 9.1. Okay, so the first thing, and we've been talking about this the whole way this morning, are the sutures. Okay, a suture is a fibrous joint found only between the bones of the skull. You don't find it in any other piece of anatomy of your skeleton. Okay, so sutures are specific to the skull. Okay, an example here, and I'll just stick with your textbook, although you know the lambdoid suture, the coronal suture, right? You know multiple sutures from your time in lab. Okay, and as a talking point, there's an interesting term that comes up, right? I mentioned just a little bit ago about the infant fontanelles, the soft spots that a child is born with, and that over time those soft spots will literally be replaced with legitimate bone tissue that that soft tissue will be replaced with osseous tissue. Okay, there's a special term that's used to refer to a fontanelle that is now fully ossified. That term is a synostosis, okay? All right, so a synostosis refers to a fontanelle that has completely turned into bone. So it has completely hardened, okay? Has completely ossified. All right, so a synostosis is a fontanelle that has ossified. Okay, Brittany, I see your comment in the chat window. Thank you. Hope you're okay. Let's continue here. All right, so next type of fibrous joint are the syndesmoses. Okay, syndesmosis is singular, syndesmoses is plural. Syndesmosis. You can see a syndesmosis there at the bottom of figure 9.1 panel C there, right? They're showing you different examples of these things. A syndesmosis is a fibrous joint which is defined by a greater amount of space, a larger separation between the articulating bones than you would typically see with a suture. Okay, this is oh, I got this note at the wrong location. Go back out here to B, synostosis. Okay, this is a type of fibrous joint characterized by a greater distance between the articulating bones than you see with a suture. Okay. Additionally, there's also going to be a larger amount of dense irregular connective tissue in the syndesmoses. Okay, an example here of a syndesmosis, I'd use the one in the bottom left corner of figure 9.1. It would be the anterior tibiofibular ligament, right? In our course, we have not asked you to memorize ligaments, and we're not generally going to do that. I think I did talk a little bit about the anterior cruciate ligament one morning with you, but here's an example of a syndesmosis, the anterior tibiofibular ligament. This piece of connective tissue joins the tibia and fibula at the distal ends of these long bones in the bottom of your leg, right? And so there's a good bit of space between the tibia and fibula at that location, and this ligament helps hold these bones together. Okay. All right. An interesting vocab word that comes out of this conversation is a special type of syndesmosis, which is only found in your jaw. You see that at the bottom right corner of figure 9.1, and this is a gomphosis. A gomphosis is a syndesmosis that's specifically associated with your teeth in your jawbone, your mandible. Okay, a gomphosis is found between the teeth and the alveolar sockets of the mandible or the maxilla itself. Okay, this is a type of syndesmosis found between the teeth and the alveolar sockets of the mandible or maxilla. Okay. All right, so there's some funny words that come out of this chapter. That's what I'm highlighting for you. Some unusual word, right? Synostosis, not an everyday word. Gomphosis, not an everyday word. Okay. All right. Okay. And so, of course, we also have other types of syndesmoses. I won't write it down there, but take a look at the interosseous membrane. Okay. Take a look at the interosseous membrane between the tibia and fibula. That's the middle picture in the bottom of figure 9.1, the middle picture there. Okay. So that would be a type of syndesmosis as well. And obviously you can really very cleanly see the considerable separation of space between the tibia and fibula. That is what word am I looking for? That is covered by the interosseous membrane. Okay. All right, folks. So those are the types of fibrous joints, sutures and syndesmoses. Okay. Let's take a look at cartilaginous joints. A more detailed look at cartilaginous joints. So we're going to take a look at figure 9.2 in a little bit more detail. Remember, a cartilaginous joint has no synovial cavity. And the articulating bones are going to be held together either by some form of cartilage, either hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage, depending on the specific joint that we're talking about. Okay. So types of cartilaginous joints. Okay, the first type of cartilaginous joint is known as a synchondrosis. That's an odd word too, isn't it? Synchondrosis, S-Y-N-C-H. Synchondrosis is singular, synchondroses is plural. A synchondrosis is a type of cartilaginous joint in which the connecting material is hyaline cartilage. Okay, so a natural example here is going to be, once again, the epiphyseal growth plate. Another term for epiphyseal growth plate is the cartilaginous growth plate. Those are synonymous phrases used interchangeably in anatomy. Okay, so we've talked about the epiphyseal growth plate in chapter 6. We pointed out that the epiphyseal growth plate is really more positioned in the metaphyseal region, right? Kind of an odd thing. But at any rate, the epiphyseal growth plate is made of hyaline cartilage, and you can see that as the middle picture of figure 9.2. So the epiphyseal growth plate of a long bone is a synchondrosis, Okay. All right. The other category of cartilaginous joint are the symphyses, or symphysis is singular, symphyses is plural. Okay. The symphysis is a cartilaginous joint in which the ends of the bones are covered in hyaline cartilage. So if we were to take a look at the pubis region of each pelvic bone, the pubis region right down there at the bottom of that structure, you would find a layer of hyaline cartilage covering the surface of the pubis bone. But you'll notice carefully, if you look at picture B there, in between the pubis bones of the left and right hip bones is a broad sheet of tissue there, which is a piece of cartilage. That cartilage is made of fibrocartilage. So you have the pubis bones, which are coated on the surface by hyaline cartilage, but then in between that is a sheet of fibrocartilage. So a symphysis has articulating bones that are covered in hyaline cartilage, and there is a piece of fibrocartilage in between the articulating bones as well. Okay, so an example here is going to be the pubic symphysis. You see it on the right panel, figure 9.2. Okay. All right. Another example of where you will find a symphysis is between, well, is in your spinal column, in your vertebral column, right? So the intervertebral joints have those pads of fibrocartilage, which we call discs, in between each vertebra, right? As the vertebrae stack in the vertebral column, there's a fibrocartilage disc in between the vertebra. That each of those joints is a symphysis as well. So each intervertebral joint is a symphysis. Okay. All right, gang. So hopefully these things are not horribly foreign to you. I mean, you have quite a bit of experience with the skeleton at this point. So hopefully the most foreign thing about this conversation is some of these new unusual words we're using to describe anatomy, which you all already have familiarity with. Okay. All right. So synchondrosis is a vocab word. Symphysis is a vocab word. Do you have any questions right now? Okay, let's continue. All right, so we've taken a more detailed look at fibrous joints, a more detailed look at cartilaginous joints. Now we're going to take a look at synovial joints in a little bit more detail. There are no subtypes really of synovial joints. So what we're going to focus on is a little bit more of traditional anatomy in a synovial joint. Okay. And we're going to talk about this anatomy from a generic perspective, which is again to say and repeat that I am not going to have an image of, I'm not going to have an image of the hip joint or the shoulder joint on your exam and ask you to label a whole bunch of stuff. That's not going to happen. I don't want you to spend your study time that way. All right. So synovial joints contain this synovial cavity, right? And again, we pointed out in figure 9.3, panel A, at the bottom right of panel A, you see that phrase articular cavity. The articular cavity is the synovial cavity. So in your book, when you see articular cavity, that is the synovial cavity. So synovial joints contain a synovial cavity, and that space within the synovial cavity is not open. It's actually filled up with a special liquid called synovial fluid. The synovial cavity contains a special lubricating fluid called synovial fluid. Okay, so that's a nice vocab phrase there, synovial fluid. Now, synovial fluid, well, okay. Okay, I'm going to put a question in your notes at this moment, and we'll put the question in and we'll type the answer in just a second. But it's a question that's important for many aspects of anatomy and physiology understanding. It's not just important for chapter 9 just because we're talking about it now, but it's a big idea that's important for understanding all of anatomy and physiology. Here's my question. So here's the question for you folks. What is the foundational fluid for all liquids like saliva, urine, aqueous humor in the eyeball, cerebrospinal fluid in the central nervous system? What is the foundational fluid for all these and any other liquid? We could, we could think about lymphatic fluid. We could think about interstitial fluid. Let me put those in there. Et cetera, in the body. What is the foundational liquid? Okay, so thanks everybody. Shay, Raquel, Brittany, I appreciate the participation. And your answers are not bad answers at all. I would change them slightly. Okay, what I'm trying to drive at is that the foundational liquid, or I could say it this way, the source liquid from which all other liquids originate. The source liquid from which all other liquids originate is going to be, drum roll, the blood. The blood, which of course many of you know is basically fancy water. Okay. What I'm trying to say to you is that all the liquids we might ever have a conversation about in the body at some point are created by an interaction or a filtering of the blood plasma. Interstitial fluid is filtered blood plasma. Lymphatic fluid is filtered blood plasma. Urine is filtered blood plasma, right? You adjust your blood volume by forming urine so that you can regulate your blood pressure. Cerebrospinal fluid, filtered blood plasma. So let me type this into the chat window and get you to respond. Here we go. What substance is filtered to form synovial fluid? What substance is filtered to form synovial fluid? Yes, Kendall, blood plasma. That's exactly right. Blood plasma, okay? All right. So that's a foundational piece of information I hope you'll take with you through the remainder of AMP1 and AMP2, that all the fluids in the body really originate by filtering the blood plasma. Okay, so let's stay here with the synovial fluid. Synovial fluid is made from filtered blood plasma, and this synovial fluid contains a molecule in it that provides a lot of lubricating features for the synovial fluid. And I'm going to ask you if you remember this substance in just a moment. Okay, so this is made of filtered blood plasma, a large quantity of dissolved hyaluronic acid. A large quantity of dissolved hyaluronic acid for lubrication. Okay, folks, question in the chat window. Hold on a second. Here he comes. In what other context in our course this semester did we mention the term hyaluronic acid? Do you remember? Kendall, you're not wrong. Can you be more precise? Kelly, you're not wrong. Can you be more precise? Okay, you're doing good, folks. You're doing okay. do you remember that hyaluronic acid is a molecule we find in the ground substance of the extracellular matrix of our skin? Okay, so it's like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to remember that. Well, there it is. Okay, so I may have also told you at the time that hyaluronic acid is a common food source of flesh-eating bacteria, right? Flesh-eating bacteria actually eat the hyaluronic acid that's part of the extracellular matrix of your skin, okay? All right, let's continue here. Synovial joints are going to be surrounded by articular capsules. Again, you can see articular capsule in panel A of figure 9.3 on the right side. Picture B also has an articular capsule, okay? And as I said, we're talking about generic ideas at this moment. So if you have the luxury of the textbook in front of you, take a look at figure 9.12. Take a look at figure 9.12, okay? Figure 9.12. Panel A, the anterior view, along the right side of panel A, towards the bottom, you see the phrase articular capsule. If you go to panel B as in boy of figure 9.12, along the left side of that image, the second term up from the bottom left of panel B, you see articular capsule. Panel C of figure 9.12, you see along the bottom right corner there, articular capsule. So my point is that you don't need to know the intimate specific detail of all these joints. I'm simply pointing out some common features of synovial joints. Okay, so synovial joints are surrounded by articular capsules, which join and stabilize the connected bones. Okay. Articular capsules are made of. Okay, articular capsules are made of. If we were to go in and do some dissection and cut some very thin slices of tissue with an instrument called a microtome, and look at things under the microscope, well, what are we going to find? Basically, we're going to find two things, folks. An articular capsule is made of a, as you look at either figure 9.3 or figure 9.12, I'm looking at figure 9.3 at the moment, you're going to find what's called a fibrous layer. Some books will call this a fibrous membrane. And you may recall our conversation about the long bone in chapter 6. Let me ask you a question in the chat window. What is the name of the membrane that covers compact bone? Okay, great. Good job, Kendall. It's periosteum. Periosteum. Folks, the fibrous membrane that we're putting down in your notes right now, that's part of the articular capsule anatomy. That fibrous membrane is an overly thickened periosteum. The fibrous membrane is an overly thickened periosteum. This is a region of the periosteum that has over thickened. Okay, kind of a neat thing. When you start putting the pieces together, it's kind of a neat thing. All right, so the fibrous membrane is actually periosteum that has over thickened. And in addition to that, part of the anatomy of an articular capsule is the synovial membrane. Okay, the synovial membrane is made of areolar connective tissue with a whole bunch of elastic fibers which provides a little bit of stretchiness to the articular capsule. So it allows stabilization of the joint with a little bit of flexibility, because obviously the joint has to move. Okay. Okay. So I'm looking at my clock right now, and I know where I want to be with things. So folks, what I'm going to do next is list out a couple vocab terms that I want you to look at. I want you to look up during your own private study time. Okay. So number 5, be aware of the following anatomy terms. Okay. And this is my way of saying, look these things up. Okay. Meniscus, labrum, bursa, and tendon sheath. Tendon sheath. Okay, so just 4 terms for you to look up. Make sure you're getting a definition. Make sure you're putting eyeballs on a visual example of what it is. Okay. Okay. So folks, there we have it. We have now described the various types of joints, primarily from a structural perspective, but we also reference the functional perspectives as well in our notes. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask? Okay. Well, if there's no questions, what we'll go on to the next major piece of chapter 9. I'm hoping I can finish this today. Well, let's see what we can do. And that is, we need to define the types of movements that the body is capable of at the synovial joints. I'm going to move pretty quick here, folks, because this is kind of Betty Crocker-ish. And what I mean by Betty Crocker-ish is kind of like reading a cookbook, and you read it, there it is, you understand it. Okay, so add 2 eggs to a bowl. Well, you know that, right? Okay, so what I'm saying is, if you just spend time to read this stuff and look at it in the book, there's not too much mystery. Okay, so first off, we have 2 types of movements, and I'll be looking at figure 9.4 and the next subsequent figures. So if you're looking at figures 9.4 and figure 9.5, you're in the right area of the textbook at this time. 2 primary types of movements that synovial joints are capable of. That would be gliding motions and angular movements. Okay, gliding motions and angular movements. So we're going to take the gliding motions first because it's quick, easy, relatively simple to envision. Gliding motion. Gliding motion is most illustrated by the bones of the wrist and ankle. Okay, if I were to take my hands and show them to you like this on the video screen, and you can do this with me at home, right? Take your hands out in front of your face, and then just take your wrists and wiggle them back and forth towards your midline, away from your midline, towards your midline, away from your midline. As you do this, what the bones of the wrist, the corpus, is doing, those tiny little bones are pretty much gliding back and forth along each other like this. And that's the imagery of figure 9.4 that your textbook is trying to show you at this time. Okay, so gliding motion is a motion in which there is a side to side or back and forth motion between bones, and most prominently, the bones that are gliding back and forth, there is no change in the angular relationship between the bones. Okay, for example, if I were to do this with my hands, on the count of 3, I'm going to change the angle of the bones. 1, 2, 3. There, I changed the angle. That is not happening. That is not happening to any great degree with the gliding motion. With the gliding motion, the bones are rubbing up against each other back and forth, but they're not changing their angular relationship, okay? Okay. So that's the gliding motion, and that's really basically all we have to say about that. Where the meat of this topic comes in is with the angular motion terms, okay? So there's going to be a whole bunch of these that we need to put into your notes, and I will mention, I think I mentioned it last time on Monday's class, that I was going to put in the study guide for exam 2 in Wiley Plus. I've done that. Your lecture exam 2 study guide is in the lecture portion of Wiley Plus under the files tab. If you've had a chance to download it or read it, you'll realize that one of the essay questions on the exam is going about these angular motion terms we're about to document in your notes. And I've placed an angular motion practice sheet in Wiley Plus as well for you, so that you can begin practicing your understanding of these terms. Okay. All right. So angular motion. Okay. When we talk about angular motion, we're talking about motion in which there is an increase or decrease in the angle between the articulating bones. For example, if I hold my arms out in front of me like this with my elbows locked straight, right? Sorry, my hands are still here, but the video camera doesn't want to participate. Okay, if I bend my elbow, all right, if I do this, I am flexing the elbow. There's a decrease in the angle. So let me ask you this in the chat window. As I'm showing you my elbows, type into the chat window, what is approximately the angle of my arm at this point between my humerus and my radius and ulna? What is the angle? Okay, good. That's what I'm hoping you would see. Okay, it's a 90-degree angle roughly. Okay, so if I start with a 90-degree angle and I make it even smaller or I make it larger, there's a change in the angle. A change in the angle is the primary characteristic of all the angular motion descriptive terms we're going to document in your notes. Motion in which there is an increase or decrease in the angle between the articulating bones. Okay. So there's many types of these terms, and I'm going to put many of them, not quite all of them, in your notes. All right, flexion. Okay, so I'm going to be bouncing around from figure 9.5 to figure 9.6 to figure 9.7 to figure 9.8 to figure 9.9. Okay, so let me just put it here. So for gliding motion, you're going to want to be looking at figure 9.4. For angular motion, you're going to want to be looking at figures 9.5 the whole way to figure 9.9. So folks, we're gonna document these things in your notes, and then I'm going to ask you to get up out of your seat this morning and do something we don't actually do very often in class, is we're going to move that body by illustrating and practicing these motion terms, okay? So flexion is first. Flexion is a decrease in the angle between articulating bones. Okay, so if my arms are held out straight like this, what is the angle between the humerus and the ulna? What is the angle between the humerus and ulna? Basically, you have a straight line here. So what's the angle between the opposite ends of a straight line? What is it? What's the angle? Type that into the chat window. Okay, good job. No, it's 180 degrees, right? 180 degrees. Okay, so right now, my arms are showing you a 180-degree angle. Sorry about the video. Right now is 180 degrees, and right now is roughly 90 degrees. Here's 90 degrees. Here's 180 degrees. Okay, so that's flexion, and you can see that at examples in different ways of figure 9.5. Okay, extension. Extension is the opposing motion of flexion. Extension is an increase in the angle between articulating bones. Okay, so if I start here at 90 degrees and I go towards 180, I increase the angle. This is an example of extension. Right now, this is extension. Okay, let's continue. Lateral flexion. Lateral flexion is movement of the trunk sideways from right to left or vice versa at the hip. Okay, so maybe some of you are in some kind of fitness class at your local gym, or you remember doing calisthenics in gym class in high school, and they may have had you do various motions where you were stretching the body a little bit. So this would be lateral flexion, right? Like this. Okay, next we have hyperextension. Hyperextension is a little weird, and honestly, hyperextension is almost always associated with injury because our joints don't tend to want to go beyond the normal range of extension. So hyper is greater than, right? Hyper is greater than. So hyperextension is a continuation of extension beyond the comfortable anatomical position. Okay, so if I'm in anatomical position right now, sideways to you, my hands are down at my sides, my palms are facing forward, right? So if I lift my arms up at the shoulder to just show you in the video window, right? So right now, I'm extending my elbow to go back to 180 degrees. But imagine if I tried to make that go past 180 degrees, right? If you have your arm out in front of you, take your other hand and try to push up on your elbow and feel how uncomfortable that starts to get as you try to invert your elbow. That's not comfortable. So if you try to go from 180 to say 210 degrees, you would start to hyperextend the joint, and that would hurt. That would damage the structure of the joint. You would probably tear the articular capsule in that location. And it just wouldn't feel good. So hyperextension is a continuation beyond the comfortable anatomical position. Let's see here. Okay, we have abduction, and there's an associated term called adduction. Abduction and adduction kind of go together like peanut butter and jelly. They're two sides of the same coin. Let's define them, then we'll talk about them. Abduction is movement of a bone or entire body part, like a limb, away from the midline of the body. And the opposing action is adduction, is movement of a body part or entire limb toward the midline of the body. You can see this illustrated in figure 9.6. Figure 9.6, take a look at letter A with the shoulder joint. That's going to be the easiest one for me to show you here in the video camera. Okay, so if you remember playing in the snow as a little boy or a little girl, or you know, hey, adults can have fun too, right? Why not go outside and play in the snow when you have the opportunity? If you ever remember laying down on the ground in the snow and moving your arms like this to make the wings of a snow angel, make the wings of a snow angel. As you bring your arms up away from the midline of the body, that is abduction with a B, ABD. This is abduction. And at any moment that you're actually bringing the arms back towards the midline of the body, that is adduction, okay? So abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction, two parts of a common process of forming snow wings in a snow angel. Okay. Let's continue, folks. All right. Letter G here is circumduction. Circumduction is shown to you in figure 9.7. Here's the definition. The movement of the distal end of a body part in a circle. So if I turn to you in the video camera so you can see my profile, and I lift my arm out to you with my fist here, I'm going to do this motion. And I do not want you to look at my entire arm. Don't look at my entire arm. Just look at my fist. And imagine that you're tracing the path of motion of the fist itself. You can see that roughly I'm forming a circle by moving my fist in this manner, okay? So that is circumduction. We have rotation. Rotation is when a bone revolves around its own longitudinal axis. You see that in figure 9.8. And the best example is when you're at a street intersection and you're turning your head left and right to see if there's any traffic coming past to be sure it's safe to go across the street, right? So simply turning your head left and right is an example of rotation. Okay. Okay, let's continue here. There's some other special terms that are called special movement terms in figure 9.9 that I'm going to put into your notes. I'm not going to put them all in, but I'll put a lot of them in. Elevation. Elevation is a superior motion. Okay. So an example would be taking your mandible when your mouth is already open and closing the mandible. So lifting the mandible up superiorly to close the mouth. That would be an example of elevation. The opposite of elevation is depression. That's an inferior motion. So an example would be closing the mandible or lowering the mandible to open the mouth. There we go. So we all have to think of different mental ideas that help us remember these things. One way that I do it for depression here is that, if I think about depression being opening the mouth, one silly way that I think about it is, if a If a politician opens his or her mouth, that's usually depressing, because whatever they say is going to be depressing. So that's how I think about it. Whatever you need to do to get these ideas into your head, make silly little things like that so it sticks in the brain. Okay. Next, we have protraction. Protraction is when you move a body part forward anteriorly in the transverse plane. Okay, so that would be the typical example of chicken head, right? I'm going to move my head forward. Looks awkward, but that's what it is. It's the chicken head motion. Going forward is protraction, and coming back to normal anatomical position from protraction is going to be retraction. A return from protraction. All right, next we have some feet terms. Okay, so dorsiflexion. Dorsiflexion is when you bend the foot upward at the ankle. Okay, if you do that, effectively, you're going to be standing on the heels of your feet. If you bend your foot downward at the ankle, you're going to be standing on your toes. The term for that kind of motion is plantar flexion. Okay, 3 more to go. We have pronation and supination. Pronation and supination are also like peanut butter and jelly, 2 sides of the same coin. They go together. In pronation is characterized by motion at your hands with your palms. Okay, so with pronation, what happens is, okay, it's hard for me to illustrate this in the video window, but if my palms are facing forward, my thumbs are lateral. They're away from the midline of my body. If I take my thumbs and I rotate them towards the midline so that my palms finish such that they are facing back or posteriorly, that is an example of pronation. Pronation is moving the palms of the hand in a manner so that the palms finish their motion in a posterior position. Okay. One way that I think about this is the word pronation starts with the letter P, and so does the word palm, and so does the final position of posterior. Pronation, palms, posterior. Make that connection and you don't confuse it with the other term. Okay. The other term is supination. Supination is moving the palms so that they finish in the anterior position. Okay, so right now I'm going to rotate so that I'm in the posterior position. So this motion is pronation. And as I do the opposite, I'm going to rotate my thumbs away from my midline once again. This is supination. Obviously, it wouldn't look that awkward if I was in a comfortable anatomical position, but you can't see my hands in the video window that way. So moving the palms of the hand so they finish their motion in an anterior position. Okay. Courtney says in the chat window that she remembers supination by thinking of soup. Okay, if that works for you, Courtney, good. Keep using it. Okay. All right, folks, let me finish the notes and then we're done here. And that would be opposition. Okay, opposition is movement of the thumb to touch the fingertips. You can see that in figure 9.9, right? So moving your thumb to touch the fingertips. Okay, that is opposition. All right, we didn't get a chance to actually do these motions. I'll do that with you first thing next class. It'll be a good way to wake up at it for 8 a.m. Okay. In the meantime, we're all done. I want to stop because you have your exam this morning. So I know you want a little break before you start. Folks, good luck on your exam. I'm proud of your efforts. It's going to pay off. Be positive. I know you can do this. Good luck. And I will see you next week. Okay. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.